The gun was already pressed against Monroe Bishop's chest when Rose Harper realized she had made the worst mistake of her life coming to Caldwell Creek. Not because she feared the man holding the weapon, not because the saloon had gone deathly silent around her, every card player and whiskey drinker frozen in their seats like figures in a photograph. Not even because the man with the gun was Wade Pruitt, the most feared cattle baron in 3 counties, a man whose name made judges sweat and lawmen look the other way. No. Rose Harper's heart seized in her chest because Monroe Bishop, the sheriff of Caldwell Creek, was not looking at the gun. He was looking at her. His dark eyes found hers across the smoky room with an expression she had never once seen on the face of a lawman in any of the broken-down, dried-up, morally bankrupt small towns she had passed through in the last 4 years. He was not afraid. He was not calculating. He was not performing for the crowd. He was asking her if she was all right. A man with a loaded revolver muzzle pressed to his sternum was asking a woman he had known for 6 days whether she was all right. Wade Pruitt growled something low and mean that Rose could not quite hear over the roaring in her ears. Monroe still did not move his gaze from hers. His jaw was set like iron, his shoulders square, his hands open at his sides, and the badge on his chest caught the lamplight even as the gun barrel dug harder into it. "You are going to take your hand off that weapon," Monroe said, and his voice was so calm it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "And then you are going to walk out of my town." Pruitt laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had silenced courtrooms and buried men. "Your town. That is real sweet, Bishop. This town belongs to me, and you know it. Every board on every building, every deed, every sorry soul inside it." Monroe finally moved his eyes from Rose. He looked at Pruitt the way a man looks at something small and unimportant that has inconvenienced him. "Then consider this your notice of eviction," he said. Rose Harper had promised herself no more small towns. She had made that promise in the wreckage of the last one, kneeling in red Kansas dust with her savings gone, her trust destroyed, and the echo of her own scream still in the air. She had promised herself that the next place her wagon wheels stopped would be a city. Somewhere big enough to disappear in. Somewhere with enough noise and motion that her dark past could not catch up with her. She had broken that promise 6 days ago when a wheel cracked 2 miles outside of Caldwell Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882. And in those 6 days, everything had changed. Rose had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a newspaper editor who believed that a woman's mind was as sharp as any man's and had raised her accordingly. She had learned to set type before she could properly read it, had learned to ask questions before she learned to accept answers, and had learned that small towns were not sanctuaries. They were systems, closed and tight as a fist, and if you were not already on the inside of that fist when it closed, you would be crushed by it. She had watched her father's newspaper be burned to the ground by men who did not like the truth he printed. She had watched him rebuild it twice. The 3rd time they burned him with it. Rose had been 22 years old, standing in the street with ash on her face, and she had not screamed. She had simply gone inside what remained of the building, pulled the most critical pieces of the printing press from the rubble, loaded them into a wagon, and driven away from Missouri without once looking back. She was 26 now, and she had worked in 4 towns since then. In the first, she had been tolerated until the work she published upset the local saloon owner and she had been run out by a mob. In the second, she had been hired and then cheated out of her pay by a man who assumed a woman alone had no legal recourse. She had found legal recourse. He had not enjoyed it. In the third, she had lasted 8 months before the marshal, who was in the pocket of a land company, decided that a newspaper asking questions about missing homestead deeds was a threat to public order. She had driven away from that 3rd town at night, in the rain, with her press in the back of her wagon and a deep, bone-level certainty that she was done. Done with small towns. Done with lawmen who wore their badges like tools of oppression rather than symbols of duty. done with placing her faith in systems that were designed to protect everyone except people like her. And then her wagon wheel had shattered outside Caldwell Creek. She had walked the last 2 miles leading her horse, a sturdy bay mare she called Tuesday, pulling the wagon behind her with the press wrapped in oilcloth. She had arrived at the edge of town at sunset, dusty and furious, and calculating how much a new wheel would cost and how long it would take to earn the money to buy one. The first person who had spoken to her was Monroe Bishop. He had been standing outside the jail, one shoulder propped against the doorframe, watching the street. He was tall, with dark hair that had been touched by sun at the edges, and a face that had clearly spent a great deal of time outdoors. He wore a plain brown vest over a gray shirt, and the star on his chest was not polished to a shine the way some sheriffs kept theirs, as if appearance were the point. It was just there, functional, worn. He had pushed off the doorframe when he saw her and her disabled wagon, and he had walked out to meet her without being asked. "Wheel," he said. "Wheel," she confirmed. "Blacksmith is 2 blocks north. Name is Samuel Greer. He is honest and he is fair. If you need somewhere to leave the wagon tonight, you can put it behind the jail. Enclosed yard, nobody will touch it." Rose had looked at him for a long moment. "You do not know what is in that wagon." "Does not matter," he said. "It is yours." She had not known what to do with that. 4 years of small towns, and no one had ever simply trusted that something was hers without questioning it, without checking, without asking for some form of proof that she had a right to what she claimed. She had stood in the fading orange light of a Texas sunset looking at a sheriff who had just extended basic human dignity to a stranger, and she had felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. "Rose Harper," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm without being a test. "Monroe Bishop, welcome to Caldwell Creek." She had told herself it meant nothing. He was simply doing his job. She had met plenty of men who were pleasant in the first 5 minutes. It was what came after that revealed the truth of them. But Samuel Greer, the blacksmith, had been exactly as honest and fair as Monroe had said. And the woman at the boarding house, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, had given Rose a clean room at a fair price without asking why a woman was traveling alone. And the general store had carried the ink and paper she needed to begin assessing whether Caldwell Creek had need of a newspaper. It did. Desperately. Because Caldwell Creek had a problem, and the problem had a name. Wade Pruitt had come to Caldwell Creek 7 years earlier with money, ambition, and a complete absence of ethical restraint. He had bought land, then bought more land, then used that land as leverage to buy influence, and used that influence to buy the silence of anyone who might have objected to the way he was doing it. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, employed half the men in Caldwell Creek directly, and held the mortgages on a significant portion of the rest of the town. He had a lawyer in his pocket, a judge in the next county who owed him favors, and an arrangement with the previous sheriff that had suited everyone except the people of the town. The previous sheriff had left 8 months ago under circumstances that no one would explain to Rose clearly, though the fear in people's eyes when they tried was explanation enough. Monroe Bishop had come in from the U.S. Marshal's service to take the job, appointed by a territorial commissioner who had received enough complaints about Caldwell Creek to finally pay attention. Rose had learned all of this in pieces, from conversations at the general store and the boarding house dining table, from the way people lowered their voices and glanced toward the eastern end of town when certain subjects came up. She had assembled it the way she assembled a newspaper, fragment by fragment, each piece fitting against the next until the whole picture emerged. On her second day in Caldwell Creek, she had gone back to Monroe. She found him at his desk, working through a stack of papers with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that most of law enforcement was paperwork rather than gunfights. He had looked up when she came in, and there had been something in his expression that she could not quite name, not surprise, more like recognition, as though he had expected her to come back. "I want to talk to you about Wade Pruitt," she said. He had set down his pen. Close the door. She had closed it. She had sat down across from him, and for the next 2 hours they had talked. It was unlike any conversation Rose had ever had with a lawman. Monroe did not dismiss her observations. He did not explain things to her as though she were slow. He did not ask who her husband was or suggest she concern herself with more appropriate matters. He listened, and then he asked questions, and his questions were good ones, the kind that showed he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He told her that he had been building a case against Prout since his first week in Caldwell Creek, that he had documentation of several land acquisitions that had been conducted under fraudulent pretenses, that there were families who had been displaced from their homesteads by Prout's men under the threat of violence, and that 2 of those families had been willing to make formal statements but were terrified of retaliation, that he had written to the territorial commissioner twice requesting support and had received polite, non-committal responses both times. "He has reach," Monroe said. "That is the problem. The case I have is good, but it is not airtight, and if I move on him before it is airtight, he will use every piece of that reach to tear it apart, and then I will never get another chance." Rose looked at him across the desk. She had been looking for the hidden motive. She always looked for the hidden motive. 4 years of small towns had taught her that when a lawman appeared to be genuinely working against the powerful and for the powerless, there was almost always something else operating beneath the surface. She could not find it. "What do you need?" she said. "A newspaper," he said without any hesitation at all. She had stared at him. "What?" "Not as a weapon," he said quickly. "I am not asking you to print accusations that I cannot back up with evidence. That would be irresponsible, and it would give Prout grounds to sue the paper into oblivion before it printed a second issue." He leaned forward. "But there are things happening in this town that the people of this town have a right to know about, questions that deserve to be asked publicly. Prout has had the silence of this community for 7 years because there has been no mechanism to break that silence. A newspaper is a mechanism." Rose had sat with this for a long moment. She thought about Missouri, about the press in the back of her wagon, wrapped in oilcloth, about the promise she had made to herself on the road out of that third broken town in the rain that she was done putting her trust in systems. Monroe Bishop was not a system. He was a man. "I need a building," she said. "A small one with solid walls because a printing press vibrates. I need access to a reliable supply of paper and ink. I need to be able to operate independently, which means I set the editorial content. Not you, not anyone else, me." "Agreed," he said immediately. "And if Prout retaliates, I need to know that your protection is not contingent on whether what I print is convenient for you." He held her gaze. "Mrs. Harper, miss," she said. Something moved in his expression. It was very brief. "Miss Harper, I will protect the press, and I will protect you because it is my job and because it is right, not because I agree with everything you print. Does that answer your question?" It did. She was not sure why it did so completely, but it did. They had shaken hands again across the desk, and that handshake had felt entirely different from the first one. Over the following 3 days, Caldwell Creek's first newspaper had begun to take shape. Monroe had identified a vacant building on the main street that had once been a dry goods store, and the building's owner, a widower named Thomas Hale who had been quietly struggling under the weight of a Prout mortgage, had agreed to a rent arrangement that suited everyone. Rose had set up her press, organized her materials, and began the painstaking process of reporting. Monroe had introduced her to 3 families who had been displaced from their land by Prout's methods. He had done it carefully, with their consent, explaining to each family what a newspaper could and could not do for them. 2 of the 3 families had agreed to speak with Rose on record. The third had declined, and Monroe had respected that immediately and completely, which impressed Rose more than almost anything else she had observed about him. She had interviewed the families over 2 long evenings, sitting in their makeshift homes on the edge of town, listening to stories that broke her heart in the particular way that injustice always broke her heart, not with shock, because she was never shocked anymore, but with a deep and weary fury that she used as fuel for her work. She had also, in those 3 days, had dinner with Monroe Bishop twice. The first time had been accidental. She had come out of the newspaper building late in the evening to discover that Mrs. Vasquez's dining room had already closed, and every other eating establishment in Caldwell Creek was a saloon. Monroe had been walking his evening patrol and had found her standing on the boardwalk looking irritated and hungry, and he had said, with a simplicity that brooked no awkwardness, "I have a pot of stew on the stove at the office. Come eat." She had gone. They had eaten stew at his desk and talked about everything except Prout. He had asked her about Missouri and she had told him, which surprised her, because she did not usually tell. He had listened to the story of her father and the newspaper with an expression of quiet, unperformed anger that she found oddly comforting, because it was anger on behalf of someone else, the purest kind. She had asked him where he was from. New Mexico Territory, he said, born to a ranching family that had come north from the borderlands. His parents were both gone, a fever when he was 19. He had 2 brothers he was close to, both working land near Santa Fe. He had joined the Marshals at 21 because he believed in the law and had been slowly coming to understand, over the following 6 years, that believing in the law and functioning within the law were 2 different things that required constant navigation. "Why stay with it then?" she asked. "Because if people who believe in it leave it, all that remains is people who do not," he said. She had no answer for that. She had thought about it for the rest of the evening and most of the night. The second dinner had been deliberate. He had knocked on the door of the newspaper building at the end of the day and asked if she wanted to eat at the hotel dining room, which apparently stayed open later than Mrs. Vasquez's establishment. She had said yes before she had time to remind herself of all the reasons she was not in Caldwell Creek for this kind of thing. The hotel dining room had white tablecloths and candles, and a menu that was surprisingly respectable for a town of this size. They had eaten roasted chicken and talked about books, which turned out to be a mutual passion. Rose had been reading and loving George Eliot's novels. Monroe had, improbably, read both Middlemarch and The Mill on the Floss, and had opinions about them that were thoughtful and a little unexpected. He also read everything he could get his hands on about the law, about history, about the natural world. She had found herself watching his hands when he talked. They were a working man's hands, marked by weather and use, but he moved them with a deliberateness that matched the way he thought and spoke. Nothing wasted, everything intentional. She had thought about those hands on the walk back to the boarding house and had firmly told herself to stop it. On the 5th day, Rose had published the first edition of the Caldwell Creek Courier. It was 4 pages, carefully reported, scrupulously fair in its language. The front page carried the story of the Delgado family and the Martinez family, both displaced from their homesteads under what the paper described as legally questionable circumstances, and what the evidence strongly suggested was outright fraud. The second page carried a factual accounting of land purchases in the county over the past 7 years, drawn from public records, with no commentary beyond the dates and figures themselves. The third page carried a call for a community meeting to discuss the future of Caldwell Creek. The fourth page carried an advertisement for Samuel Greer's blacksmith shop and a note welcoming readers to submit letters. Rose had printed 200 copies and distributed them herself, walking the length of the main street with a stack under her arm before she could lose her nerve. By afternoon, every copy was gone. By evening, the community meeting announcement had drawn 40 RSVPs, and Caldwell Creek was buzzing with a sound Rose recognized from her father's time, the sound of people who had been silent discovering they had words. And by the following morning, which was this morning, she had received a visit from Wade Prout. He had not come alone. He had come with 3 of his men, large and unhurried and deliberately positioned at the back and sides of the newspaper building, so that the conversation could not be easily exited. Prout himself was a broad man in his mid-40s with expensive clothes, and the kind of settled confidence that came from never once having faced a consequence he could not buy his way out of. His face was reddened by years of sun and, Rose suspected, years of whiskey, and his eyes were small and pale and currently fixed on her with an expression she recognized immediately. He thought she was afraid of him. He thought the correct expression of that was to look patiently amused, the way a man looks at a child who has done something impudent. "Miss Harper," he said, settling into the chair across from her press without being invited, "I understand you are new to our town. Allow me to welcome you properly." "I have been here 5 days," Rose said. "I am not new." One of his men moved slightly, a small adjustment of weight that was meant to be noticed. Rose did not look at him. "That newspaper you put out yesterday," Prout said. "I read it with interest. A lot of interesting things in it. A lot of claims made by people who are, how shall I say it, not entirely reliable sources." "The land transfer records are public documents," Rose said. "They do not have a reliability problem." Prout's amusement became slightly less patient. "You know, some towns welcome journalists and some towns find that journalists create more trouble than they are worth. Caldwell Creek could go either way on that." "Then I suppose we will see which way it goes," Rose said. She had kept her voice steady through the entire conversation, which was an achievement she was proud of, because there was a part of her that understood perfectly well that Wade Prout was not making idle observations. He was laying out the shape of what was coming. He was describing the trap before springing it, which was what men like him did when they were confident that the trap was inescapable. After he left, she had gone directly to Monroe. She had found him already aware. One of the men who had been at the newspaper building that morning was apparently someone Monroe had been watching, and the word had traveled fast. Monroe had listened to her account of the conversation with the same focused calm she was beginning to recognize as his natural state under pressure. "He is going to move," Monroe said. "Against the newspaper." "Against me," Monroe said. "The paper is the last piece. He has been looking for an opportunity to force a confrontation and discredit me, or remove me. He cannot do it quietly anymore because too many people are watching. So he is going to do it loudly, and he is going to try to make it look like I am the problem." He had looked at her then with an expression she could not entirely read. There was something in it beyond the professional assessment of the situation, something that seemed almost like apology or warning or both. "You should know that being associated with me may make you a target," he said. "I am already a target," Rose said. "He came to my building this morning. Being associated with me in the way that he started again. People in this town have begun to talk about you and me, about the dinners and he made a small gesture toward the desk between them. The work we have been doing together. Prout will use that. He will try to paint this as a personal crusade rather than a legitimate investigation." Rose looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me we should not be seen together?" "I am telling you that I do not want you to be hurt by association with me if this goes badly." "And I am telling you," she said, "that I am not interested in adjusting my behavior based on what Wade Prout might decide to do with it. I have done that in 3 other towns and it never protected me from anything." Monroe Bishop looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the jail window and laid itself across his face, and Rose Harper, who had built very careful walls around herself over the course of a very difficult 4 years, felt the upper course of those walls begin to crack. "You are remarkable," he said. It was not a compliment designed to flatter. It was simply an observation, stated the way he stated all things, with the quiet precision of a man who chose his words deliberately. She had felt the color come into her face and had looked away. It was 2 hours after that conversation that she had walked into the saloon to deliver a copy of the paper to the owner, who had been one of the 40 RSVPs for the community meeting, and had found Wade Prout staging his confrontation in exactly the location and manner Monroe had predicted. And Monroe had walked in 3 minutes after her, and Prout had drawn his gun, and Monroe had looked at Rose across the saloon with dark, calm eyes and asked without words whether she was all right. Now Rose stood in the silent saloon watching the standoff and thinking, with terrible clarity, that she had ridden away from 3 towns and left people behind in all of them. Families who had talked to her and then faced retaliation after she was gone. A blacksmith who had fixed her wagon wheel once and told her quietly that he hoped things would change. A school teacher who had cried when Rose left because she said it felt like losing the only honest voice in the county. Rose Harper was not riding away from Caldwell Creek. She moved. It was not planned. It was the product of a decision made somewhere beneath conscious thought, the kind of decision that comes from having finally reached the bottom of patience with one's own caution. She walked across the saloon floor, her boots loud in the silence, until she was standing next to Monroe Bishop, not behind him. Next to him, Prout looked at her with a kind of contemptuous disbelief. "You want to be standing here for this." "I do not particularly want to be standing here," Rose said, "but here I am." Monroe made a small sound that in a different room might have been a laugh, and then the door opened again. Samuel Greer came in, then Thomas Hale, then Elena Vasquez, then 2 other men and a woman that Rose did not know by name but had seen in the street, then more. They came in quietly, without ceremony, filling the saloon until it was packed with Caldwell Creek residents standing shoulder to shoulder, and not one of them was standing near Prout. Monroe had said once that he needed a mechanism to break the silence. A newspaper was a mechanism, but the thing about a mechanism was that it did not work alone. It needed people willing to turn the wheel. Prout's eyes moved across the crowd. Something in his face changed. The gun in his hand remained where it was, pressed to Monroe's chest, but the settled confidence in his expression had developed a crack. "You going to shoot the sheriff in front of 40 witnesses?" Monroe said quietly. Prout stared at him. "Because if you are," Monroe continued in the same conversational tone, "you should know that I have already deposited copies of my complete case file with 3 separate parties outside of this county. Everything I have on the land fraud, the fraudulent mortgages, the intimidation of homesteaders, and 2 other matters I have not made public yet. If anything happens to me, those files go to the Territorial Commissioner, to the Federal Land Office, and to the Associated Press Wire Service. Miss Harper has been kind enough to help me draft the wire service summary." Rose had not drafted any summary. She had no idea he was going to say this. She kept her expression perfectly neutral. Prout's gun hand was trembling. "This is not over," he said. "It actually is," Monroe said. "You just have not understood that yet." Prout lowered the gun. He looked at Rose with a hatred so pure it was almost clarifying, and then he looked at the crowd, and then he walked out of the saloon with his men following, and the door swung shut behind him, and the saloon erupted into noise. Rose realized she had been holding her breath for what felt like several minutes. She let it out slowly. Monroe turned to look at her. He was closer than he had been in any of their previous conversations, and she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the place where his jaw was tight with something he had not let show during the confrontation. "That was not in the plan," he said. "What part?" "Any of it," he said. "You standing next to me, all of these people coming in, though I suspect those 2 things are connected." They were connected. Rose had not organized it, but she had not needed to. The first edition of the Courier had done something she recognized from her father's time, but had not seen in 4 years. It had made people feel like the truth was possible. And when people felt that, some of them became brave. "Are you actually right?" Rose asked. "About the case files?" A corner of his mouth moved. "I will be by tomorrow morning." She stared at him. "You improvised that entire thing." "I improvised the timeline," he said. "The files themselves are real. I have been building them for 8 months. Rose Harper looked at Monroe Bishop standing in a saloon in Caldwell Creek, Texas, in the year 1882, with a star on his chest and composure in his eyes, and something underneath both of those things that she was trying very hard not to look at directly, because if she did, she was not sure she could look away. "I need to write about what just happened," she said, somewhat desperately. "Of course you do," he said. He reached out and very briefly, very carefully touched her elbow. It was 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then he let go. "Go right." She went. But she thought about those 2 or 3 seconds for a very long time. The following week was the most exhausting and consequential period Rose Harper had experienced since the burning of her father's newspaper. It was also, she admitted privately to herself in quiet moments, the most alive she had felt in 4 years. Monroe moved on Prout methodically and without haste, which was, she was learning, his standard approach to everything that mattered. He had indeed assembled his case files and transmitted copies to the parties he had named in the saloon, and the Territorial Commissioner's office had responded with a speed that suggested the governor had become involved, which Monroe confirmed without much satisfaction. Political machinery moved when it was embarrassed into motion, he said. Not much glory in that, but a practical man took what worked. The community meeting happened 3 days after the saloon confrontation. Rose had expected perhaps 60 people. 112 came, filling the meeting hall past capacity and spilling out the doors. Rose sat to one side with her notebook, reporting. Monroe sat at the front table, listening. What came out of that meeting was extraordinary. Not just the testimonies about Prout, though those were damning and specific, and several of them were new information even to Monroe. What was extraordinary was the quality of the silence between testimonies, the silence of people who had been carrying individual fears and were discovering, in real time, that they were not individual at all. The silence of a community recognizing itself. Monroe had let people speak without interruption. He had asked clear, careful questions when clarification was needed. He had thanked each speaker without performing gratitude, with a genuine directness that Rose found herself studying the way she studied good writing. He had at the end given a straightforward, unheroic account of where the legal process stood and what it would likely look like going forward, including the possibility that it would be slow, that Prout had lawyers and resources, and that the community should prepare for a period of sustained difficulty. No promises he could not keep. No theater. Just the truth in plain words. On the way out, Elena Vasquez had leaned over to Rose and said, "We have not had a lawman worth trusting since before my children were born." I had forgotten what it felt like. Rose had written that down. She put it in the second edition of the Courier. Over the following days, Monroe worked and Rose worked, and they reported their progress to each other in evening conversations that had become the rhythm of her days in a way she was not fully examining. He would come by the newspaper building or she would come by the jail, and they would sit across a desk from each other and talk about what they had found and what it meant and where it was going. And sometimes they talked about other things entirely, and the evenings became a kind of anchor that she was not sure she had a right to rely on but was relying on anyway. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, not in the way that men watched women in saloons, assessing and possessive, more as though she were something he was still trying to understand but was committed to understanding correctly. She noticed that she was doing the same thing. 2 weeks after the publication of the first Courier, federal marshals arrived in Caldwell Creek. There were 4 of them, sent from the commissioner's office following the transmission of Monroe's case files, and a letter that had apparently come from someone higher in the territorial administration than anyone in Caldwell Creek had expected to be paying attention. Monroe met them at the edge of town. Rose was there because she was covering it for the paper, and also because she could not quite manage to be anywhere else. The lead marshal was a compact, efficient man named Hayes who looked at everything with the trained dispassion of someone who processed difficult information for a living. He shook Monroe's hand and then looked at Rose with a question in his expression. "Rose Harper," she said, "Caldwell Creek Courier." Hayes looked at Monroe. "The paper that started this." "The paper that documented what was already happening," Monroe said. Hayes almost smiled. "Right." He looked at Rose again. "You are going to want to stay out of the way when we move. After, you can print whatever you like." "Understood," Rose said. The arrest of Wade Prout happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after Rose Harper's wagon wheel had cracked 2 miles outside of town. It was not dramatic in the way that the saloon confrontation had been dramatic. Federal marshals tended toward efficiency over performance. Pruitt was at his ranch house, and they went there with Monroe and 2 of his deputies, and they served the warrant, and Pruitt was brought in with his hands bound, and his face white with a fury that had nowhere to go. Rose watched him come down the main street of Caldwell Creek in the custody of federal officers, and she thought about the Delgado family and the Martinez family and Elena Vasquez's comment about trusting a lawman. She thought about the families who had not agreed to speak, who had been too afraid, and she hoped that this morning felt like something to them, even if she could not know that it did. She looked at Monroe walking a half-step behind the marshals, his face quiet and watchful, doing the unshowy work of follow-through that comes after the dramatic moment, and is harder than the dramatic moment in almost every way. He caught her eye as Pruitt was loaded into a transport wagon. Something passed between them. It was brief and wordless, and it contained more weight than most conversations Rose had ever had. Pruitt's lawyer arrived from the next county that afternoon, and the legal process properly began, which would, as Monroe had promised, take considerable time. But the immediate threat was contained, and the cloud that had sat over Caldwell Creek for 7 years had lifted enough that people were beginning to breathe differently. Rose could see it in the way they moved through the street, a slight unclenching, a willingness to make eye contact, to speak above a murmur. The 3rd edition of the Courier covered the arrest in full. Rose wrote it carefully, sticking to documented facts, resisting the temptation to editorialize, letting the facts speak with the eloquence that facts possessed when they were the right facts arranged in honest order. She wrote a separate piece for the inside page about what the community meeting had demonstrated about collective action, about the particular courage required to speak publicly in a place where silence had been enforced for years. She sent copies on the stage to 3 other towns and to the wire service. By the end of the week, she had received responses from 2 of those towns asking where they could subscribe. On the evening of the day the 3rd edition came out, Monroe came by the newspaper building near closing time. Rose was cleaning the press, a tedious and ink-stained process that she had performed so many times it was almost meditative. She heard him knock and said to come in without looking up. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was a kind of comfort in itself, the ease of being in the same room without needing to fill it with words. "Hayes told me the commissioner is recommending you for a commendation," Monroe said finally, "for public service journalism." Rose looked up. "A commendation." "It is basically a certificate, I think, not worth much on its own." "I do not want a certificate," Rose said. "I want the Delgado family to get their land back." "That process has started," Monroe said. "It will take a while. Lawyers on the other side are going to complicate it. But the commissioner's office has an interest in demonstrating that the process works, so they will push." Rose went back to cleaning the press. The sound of the cloth on the metal was slow and rhythmic in the quiet. "Are you staying?" Monroe asked. She did not look up immediately. She had been waiting for this question. She had been waiting for it in the same way she had been waiting for whether she could see on the horizon, understanding that it was coming and not knowing quite what to do when it arrived. "That depends," she said. "On what?" She set down the cloth and looked at him. He was watching her with that expression she had catalogued, not performing, not calculating, not waiting for a specific answer, just watching, willing to receive whatever came. "On whether there is enough here to stay for," she said. Monroe stood up from the chair. He moved across the room slowly, with the deliberateness she had observed in everything he did, and stopped on the other side of the press. They were separated by the machine that had brought her here and sustained her here, and he was close enough that she could see the small details of him clearly, the crease at his collar from a long day, the ink stain on his right hand that had not come from him touching the press. "You have the stain," she said, pointing at his hand. He looked at it. "I picked up one of the rollers earlier when you stepped out. I was curious about how it worked. Rose stared at him. You were curious about how my press worked and you just picked it up and looked at it. Yes, he said. Was that wrong? It was not wrong. It was actually the most appropriate response to curiosity she could imagine, the simple direct satisfaction of it, and it was so completely consistent with everything she had observed about Monroe Bishop that it broke something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. No, she said. It was not wrong. He was very close. The lamp was lit and the evening was dark outside the window, and the press stood between them like an altar made of metal and purpose. Rose, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the prefix. She looked up at him. Yes. I would like to tell you something, and I want to be precise about it, so that it is honest and not excessive. All right, she said. I think you are the most singular person I have encountered in 6 years of work that has introduced me to a remarkable range of people. I think the way you are in the world, the way you fight and ask questions and refuse to be diminished, is extraordinary. I think you deserve to be in a place that deserves you. He paused. I would very much like for that place to be Caldwell Creek. Rose Harper had received declarations before. She had been courted in Missouri by men of good family who had expressed their feelings in the proper, formal language of the time. She had received attentions in her travels from men who were more interested in what they imagined her life must be like than in her actual self. None of them had said anything remotely like what Monroe had just said, because Monroe had not told her she was beautiful or charming, or that she made the room better. He had told her that the way she was in the world was extraordinary. I think Caldwell Creek might deserve to be in the place, she said, and her voice came out slightly unsteady, which she decided to allow. Monroe reached across the press and took her hand. He held it the way he had shaken her hand on that first evening, firmly and without pretense, but differently from that too, because his thumb traced a small, careful circle on the back of her hand that said things that formal language was not equipped to say. I should tell you my flaws, he said. Please do, she said. I am stubborn about process. I take too long to act when I have not yet reached certainty. I sleep badly during complicated cases, and I am not good company on those mornings. I have, he considered, a very strong sense of when something is wrong, and sometimes it makes me difficult to live near. I published a newspaper in a town controlled by a man who could have had me killed, Rose said. I think I can manage someone with a strong sense of when something is wrong. Monroe looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, not by softening it but by filling it with warmth that had clearly been there all along, simply not displayed because he was not in the habit of display. She felt the smile go through her like sunlight through glass. They stood like that, hands connected across the press, for a long, warm moment. Then Rose came around the press and Monroe turned toward her, and it was the most natural thing in the world, the way it happened, with no performance and no flourish, just his arms around her and her face against his shoulder and the quiet certainty of being exactly in the right place. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, gentle and unhurried. She felt him exhale, a long breath of something released. Stay, he said. Yes, she said. I will stay. They did not kiss that night. They stood in the newspaper building for a while longer, talking quietly about things that mattered and things that did not matter, equal in their importance because the conversation itself was the point. Then Monroe walked her back to the boarding house and said good night at the door, and Rose went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the ceiling and smiled until her face ached. It was nothing like the small towns that had come before. She had known that already, but she knew it differently now. In the weeks that followed, Caldwell Creek reconstructed itself around the absence of Wade Pruitt's grip on its economy and its silence. It was not a simple process. Several businesses that had depended on Pruitt's contracts suffered real hardship in the interim, and Monroe worked with the merchants and the new county commissioner, a woman named Patricia Flores, who had been elected in a special proceeding, to create a transitional arrangement that kept the worst of the economic disruption from falling entirely on the people least able to bear it. The homesteaders whose land had been fraudulently acquired began a formal legal reclamation process. The Federal Land Office sent an agent, a thorough and rather humorless man who was nonetheless genuinely committed to righting the record. The first family to have their deed restored was the Delgado family, in a brief, formal proceeding at the courthouse that Monroe attended and Rose covered. And when Alina Delgado, 43 years old and bone-thin from 2 years of displacement, received her deed back, she held it with both hands and did not say anything for a full minute. And Rose wrote that silence into the paper because some things were more eloquent than words. The Courier had by this point established a subscription base of 240 households in Caldwell Creek and the surrounding county. Rose hired a compositor, a young man of 20 named William Cross who had been working at the general store and had the particular quality of meticulous attention that good print work required. She was training him in all aspects of production, and he was learning with an enthusiasm that reminded her of herself at that age, before the burning, when she had still believed that the truth in print was an unconditional good. She still believed it. She had rebuilt that belief brick by careful brick since arriving in Caldwell Creek, and it was sturdier than the original now because it had been tested. Monroe and Rose had fallen into a relationship that was, by the standards of Caldwell Creek in 1882, somewhat unconventional in its visible dimensions. They walked together on Sunday mornings before the town was properly awake, along the creek that gave the town its name, where cottonwood trees grew thick and the water ran clear and cold even in autumn. They ate dinner together most evenings, sometimes at the hotel, sometimes at Alina Vasquez's boarding house table, where Alina treated Monroe with a warm, approving directness that Rose found extremely amusing. They sat on the boardwalk outside the jail sometimes in the evenings, just the two of them, and Monroe would drink coffee and Rose would have tea if she had any, and they would watch the street and talk about nothing in particular and everything in general. People talked, of course. People in small towns always talked. But the quality of the talk had changed since the Prout situation, because the community had been through something together and had come out of it with a different sense of itself, one that included the possibility of being on the side of something good. Monroe's standing in the town was quietly enormous, in the way that comes from consistent right action rather than from performance. And Rose was the woman who had started the Courier, who had sat at the kitchen table with Alina Delgado and listened for 3 hours to a story that the law had failed to hear, and who had put that story in print in plain, clear language that anyone could read. Nobody in Caldwell Creek was inclined to speak about either of them with anything other than respect. One afternoon in November, 6 weeks after the arrest, Monroe came by the newspaper building in the middle of the day, which was unusual. Rose was in the middle of typesetting the 4th edition and looked up with her hand still on the compositing stick. "What happened?" she said, because his expression was one she had learned to read, not alarm but significance. "A letter came," he said. He held it out. It was addressed to both of them from the family of the first homesteader, a man named Carlos Delgado, who had died during the 2 years of displacement. His widow, Alina Delgado, had written that the family wanted to invite Monroe and Rose to dinner at their restored property on the occasion of the first meal cooked in their own kitchen in 2 years. Rose read it twice. She had been present at the deed restoration, but she had been there as a reporter, and she had maintained the careful professional distance she maintained at everything she covered. Reading this letter in Monroe's hand, with Monroe standing across from her, she could not maintain that distance. She sat down on her stool and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. "Rose," Monroe said, and his voice was low and careful. "I am fine," she said. "I am just—" She stopped. "My father would have liked this," she said. "He would have liked all of this. The paper and the meeting and the people coming out and this letter. He would have liked it very much." Monroe crossed the room and sat on the edge of the press table and was simply present, which was exactly what she needed and what he always provided without being asked. After a moment she lowered her hands and looked at him. "Tell me something," she said. "What would you like to know?" "When you came to Caldwell Creek," she said, "before me, were you," she tried to find the precise question, "were you lonely?" He thought about it with the seriousness she had come to expect from him when he was being asked something real. "Yes," he said. "This kind of work is isolating by nature. You cannot be close to many people when you are investigating people in the same community." And he paused. I had not found a way to think about something beyond it. The work was the whole of it, and that felt sustainable, but it was not. "And now," she said, "now I think about what comes after the work," he said. "More than I used to." She looked at him steadily. "What does that look like?" Monroe Bishop, who was precise and careful and not given to excess, said. "It looks like you." They went to dinner at the Delgado property on a Friday evening in November, and Alina Delgado cooked for them, and the whole family ate together, and Monroe helped Carlos's eldest son, a 15-year-old named Roberto, with a problem he was having with the fencing along the creek boundary, because Monroe had grown up on a ranch, and fencing was something he knew. Rose sat with Alina and her daughters and listened to them talk about the land, the particular love that people who work land have for it, the way it becomes part of the self in a way that displacement wounds more deeply than can be easily expressed. She thought about what it meant to belong to a place. She had moved so many times, and she had always thought of belonging as something that happened by default, that you either came from somewhere and therefore belonged to it, or you did not. She had not considered that it might be something you built, something constructed through work and presence and the gradual accumulation of connection. She was building it here. She could feel it happening. On the wagon ride back to town in the cool November dark, Monroe drove and Rose sat beside him on the bench, and the stars were extraordinary. The huge, brilliant western sky spread above them like a demonstration of infinity. At some point, the distance between them on the bench had narrowed to nothing, and she was leaning against his shoulder, and he had one arm around her and the other handling the reins, and neither of them had marked the transition. It had simply happened. "I need to tell you something," Rose said. "Tell me." "I promised myself after the third town that I was done with small places, that I was going to go somewhere large enough that I could not be found and could not be hurt and could not be failed by the systems that run small towns." She felt his arm tighten slightly around her. "I broke that promise because of a wheel. A fortunate wheel," Monroe said. "I want you to know," she continued, "that I did not intend to stay. For the first 3 days I was calculating the cost of the wheel repair and planning my route, and this was," she gestured at the surrounding town, the surrounding night, the surrounding everything. "It was just an interruption. I had decided on distance. I had decided that caring about a place and its people was something I could not afford." "What changed?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "You asked me about the wagon and said it did not matter what was in it because it was mine. And then you told me the blacksmith was honest without being asked." She paused. "It seems very small." "It is not small," Monroe said. "No," she agreed. "It was not small at all. I just did not know how to process it immediately because it had been a very long time since someone had simply been decent to me without wanting something in return." Monroe stopped the wagon at the edge of town where the road curved and the cottonwoods made a canopy overhead, bare now in November but still sheltering. He set the brake and turned toward her, and in the dark his face was all shadow and warm light from the distant lanterns of the town. "Rose," he said. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was gentle and deliberate and wholly itself, not a beginning of something else but a complete thing, and it said everything his words had been building toward with such careful precision over the past weeks. She kissed him back with equal completeness, her hand on the lapel of his coat, and the horses stood quietly, and the stars were everywhere and Caldwell Creek glittered at the end of the road. When they parted, she leaned her forehead against his. Both of them were breathing slightly unsteadily. "Stay," he said again. He had said it once before in the newspaper building, and then it had meant, "Stay in Caldwell Creek." This time it meant more than that, and they both knew it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Not this time." The winter of 1882 in Caldwell Creek was cold and clear, and the town settled into a quieter rhythm than it had known for years. Wade Pruitt's trial was scheduled for the following spring in the county seat, and the legal preparations continued through December and into January with the steady, unglamorous labor of court proceedings. Monroe made 2 trips to the county seat to give testimony and confer with the federal attorneys, and Rose managed both his absence and the newspaper with equal competence, though she admitted to herself that the evenings when he was away were considerably less pleasant than the ones when he was not. She had moved out of the boarding house in December, having found a small house 2 streets from the newspaper building. It had a front room that caught the morning light, and a kitchen that needed work, and a back room that was going to become a library the moment she could afford enough shelving. Monroe had helped her move the pieces of press equipment that she kept at the house rather than the building, which was the majority of them. He had moved the heaviest components with a matter-of-fact physical capability that Rose found herself watching with an attention she was no longer pretending was anything other than what it was. He had dinner with her at her house that first evening, and they sat by the fire in the front room and talked until late. And when he left, he kissed her at the door with the same gentleness and certainty as that first kiss under the cottonwoods, and she stood in the doorway watching him walk up the street toward the jail and thought, with a wonder that still surprised her, that she was happy. It was not a simple happiness. It was complicated by ongoing legal processes, and by the difficulty of running a newspaper, and by the occasional dark night of the soul in which she heard her father's voice and thought about Missouri, and grief moved through her like weather. But underneath all of that, like bedrock under variable terrain, there was the solid, sustaining fact of Caldwell Creek and of Monroe Bishop, and of the life she was building here with both hands. In January, Monroe came to dinner on a Sunday and brought flowers, which were improbable in January in Texas, but he had managed them somehow. Dried wildflowers from the autumn arranged with the careful consideration he brought to everything. He set them on her table and sat down with the slight self-consciousness of a man who has done something tender and is waiting to see if it was the right thing. She took his face in her hands and kissed him and told him they were beautiful, and he was, briefly, the most uncomplicated she had ever seen him, the self-consciousness dissolving into something open and warm and very young, and she loved him for it with a clarity that made her catch her breath. She had not yet said those words out loud. She was working up to it. She had found, after years of not loving anyone, that the words required a particular quality of courage she was still assembling. In February, 2 things happened. The first was that the wire service ran a story about the Caldwell Creek situation and the Courier, and it was picked up by 3 major newspapers, including one in Dallas and one in Chicago, and Rose received letters from readers in both cities, one of which was from a woman in Chicago who said that reading about what Rose had done made her believe that honest journalism was still possible. And Rose sat at her kitchen table and cried about that in a way she had not cried about anything in a very long time. The second thing that happened in February was that Monroe asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not make a speech. They were eating dinner at her house on a Wednesday, something she had cooked from a recipe Elena Vasquez had given her, and he was telling her about a letter he had received from one of his brothers in Santa Fe, and he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her across the table. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have been thinking about how to say this in a way that is precise and not excessive, and I have decided that the precise and not excessive way is just to say it directly." Rose set down her fork. She looked at him. The lamp on the table between them was steady and warm. "Monroe," she said. "Yes. I love you," she said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say that, and this seems to be it." He was still for a second, and then he reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was firm and warm and completely without pretense. "I love you," he said. "Marry me." "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed. It was a full laugh, real and warm, and it filled her kitchen, and she thought she would remember that sound for the rest of her life. They were married in March of 1883, in the early spring when the creek was running high, and the cottonwoods were beginning to leaf, and Caldwell Creek had the particular luminous quality of a place that has come through difficulty and is tentatively discovering what recovery feels like. The ceremony was conducted by the circuit preacher, a man named Father David Romero, who had served the area for 20 years and was well loved and somewhat deaf. Elena Vasquez stood up for Rose. Monroe's brother Daniel had ridden 3 days from Santa Fe to stand up for Monroe, and he was so clearly and openly pleased about the whole situation that Rose liked him immediately and completely. 45 people attended, which was more than Monroe had anticipated, and exactly what Rose had, because she had been paying attention to how many people cared about Monroe Bishop in the quiet, daily way that manifested as small acts of regard. A coffee left on the jail desk by someone who knew he had worked through the night. A pie delivered on his birthday by Samuel Greer's wife. A handshake that lasted slightly longer than usual because words were harder, and those people were all there. When Father Romero pronounced them married and Monroe kissed her in the spring air with the creek running nearby and the whole small, beautiful town watching, Rose Harper, who was now Rose Bishop though she would keep the Harper for the paper, felt the last of the walls come down. Not painfully, the way she had feared it would feel when she imagined it in her guarded years. Easily, like something that had been holding its shape past its usefulness and was finally released. They had a wedding dinner at the hotel that ran past midnight and involved a fiddle player that Samuel Greer produced from somewhere and dancing that Monroe participated in with a seriousness that was absolutely characteristic and completely charming. Daniel Bishop gave a speech that was brief and eloquent and included several observations about his brother that made Monroe look at the ceiling and made everyone else laugh warmly. That night in the house that was now theirs together, with the spring wind at the window and the lamp burning low, they lay awake talking long after they might have been expected to sleep, the way people do when they are so full of being happy that sleep seems like a waste of it. "Tell me something you have not told me yet," Rose said. Monroe thought for a moment. "When you first came into the jail," he said, "the second day, when you said you wanted to talk about Prout." "Yes. I had been watching you since you arrived in town. Not in any," he paused, "not in any inappropriate sense. In the sense of I noticed you. I notice most people, but I noticed you particularly." "Did you notice that you were calculating, always calculating, looking for the trap before it was set, and that underneath the calculation there was something," he searched for the word, "bereft, like someone who had lost a specific kind of hope and was managing without it?" Rose was quiet. "And when you came in and asked about Prout," he continued, "the calculation was still there, but the other thing had shifted. There was something more present, and I thought," he stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought, be careful with this one, Monroe, because she has been hurt by small towns, and if you give her reason to be hurt by this one, it will be unforgivable." Rose turned to look at him in the dim room. "To whom?" "To myself," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart. "I was bereft," she said. "You are correct about that. I had decided that the particular kind of hope I had lost was not something I could afford to carry anymore. That caring about a place and wanting to make it better and believing in people was too costly. And now?" "And now," she said, "I think it is the only thing worth the cost." Monroe put his hand over hers. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." Wade Prout's trial took place in May of 1883. Rose attended every session and reported on it for the Courier, as well as filing dispatches to the Dallas and Chicago papers that had run the earlier story. The trial was long and complicated, as Monroe had predicted, and Prout's lawyers were skilled and expensive. But the evidence was solid, assembled with the patience and precision that Monroe had brought to 8 months of careful work, and the federal attorneys were good at their jobs. and the jury, made up of men from the county who had not been in Pruitt's direct pocket, deliberated for a day and a half and came back with convictions on 9 of 11 counts, including the most serious land fraud charges. Pruitt was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary at Huntsville. The day the verdict was read, Rose filed her dispatch to the wire service and then went directly to the jail, where Monroe was sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular with the expression she associated with the period of adjustment after something significant had concluded. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She sat down across from him. "How do you feel?" He considered. "Satisfied," he said, "not triumphant. The Delgado family still lost 2 years. The Martinez family lost their livestock and most of their savings, even with the land restored. There were people in this town who were afraid for 7 years. None of that is erased." "No," Rose said, "but it is acknowledged, and acknowledged is different from erased." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "you are right about that." "I know," she said, and he smiled. Summer in Caldwell Creek was hot and busy and splendid in its ordinary way. The Courier expanded to a weekly 6-page edition. The homestead reclamation process continued its slow progress. Monroe took on a deputy, a reliable young man of 24 named Luis Mendoza, who had come to Caldwell Creek from the south, and who learned quickly and worked hard and became, over several months, someone Monroe trusted without qualification. Rose and Monroe settled into married life with the same quality of attentiveness they brought to everything. She learned his rhythms, the early mornings when he was at his best, the poor sleep during complex investigations, the way he needed quiet after a long day of dealing with other people's crises. He learned hers, the editorial intensity that made her impossible to interrupt on deadline days, the occasional melancholy that came from thinking about her father, the deep particular satisfaction she took in a well-printed page, and how to give her the space to feel it. They argued sometimes, because they were both strong-minded and neither of them believed in the suppression of honest disagreement. Their disagreements were, like their conversations, direct and substantive, and resolved without the kind of cold withdrawal that Rose had seen poison other relationships. Monroe had opinions and he stated them. So did she. They were not always the same opinions. This turned out to be one of the things she loved most about their life together. In the autumn of 1883, Rose discovered she was pregnant. She told Monroe on a Sunday morning walk along the creek, partly because the creek was where she thought most clearly and partly because she wanted to tell him somewhere she loved. He stopped walking and turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen before, open and slightly undone, and then he pulled her against him with a gentleness that was different from his usual gentleness, more careful, as though she were something he was already protecting. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than well. I am terrified and very happy and already trying to figure out how to manage the press in the later months." He laughed, muffled in her hair. "That is exactly what I expected you to say." "Well," she said, "you know me." "I do," he said. "Yes." Their son was born in the spring of 1884, which felt thematically appropriate to Rose, who had a strong sense of narrative and was aware that new life in spring was perhaps too neat a symbol, but who was not going to argue with it. The birth was attended by the town's doctor and by Elena Vasquez, who had appointed herself in this role without exactly being asked, and who was magnificent in it. Monroe was in the house, not in the room, because that was how it was done, but Rose could hear him in the front room and she found his proximity steadying. When Elena Vasquez came out and told him he had a son, Rose heard the sound he made, something brief and completely involuntary that she would keep in her memory as one of the most honest sounds she had ever heard from another person. He came in and saw her and the baby, and he sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand and looked at the small face with an expression of complete, uncomplicated wonder. "He looks like you," Monroe said. "He does not look like anyone yet," Rose said. "He looks like a baby." "He looks like you," Monroe said again, with perfect confidence. They named him James Daniel Bishop, for Monroe's father James and his brother Daniel, and he was a loud, demanding, healthy boy who Monroe took to carrying around the newspaper building in the evenings when Rose was working, which kept James quiet and simultaneously allowed Monroe to read dispatches and case documents, which Rose found both practical and unreasonably charming. Caldwell Creek continued to grow through 1884 and into 1885. A new school was built, largely through the advocacy of Patricia Flores and a committee of town parents, on land that had previously been held by one of Pruitt's subsidiary companies and was now returned to public use. The doctor opened a proper clinic. A second mercantile opened and created some healthy competition with the first. The Delgado family expanded their ranch operation and employed 3 men from town, making good on the possibility that fairness in land ownership created economic benefit for the whole community, rather than just the individual with the deed. Monroe was reappointed as sheriff by the county commission without opposition, which was both a vote of confidence and, as he observed to Rose privately, a reminder that the job continued regardless of how resolved the immediate crisis felt. There was always the next thing. There was always someone who needed help and someone who needed holding accountable. That was the nature of it. Rose published the Courier without interruption through James's babyhood, relying on William Cross's increasingly skilled production work, and on a schedule that was complicated but manageable because she and Monroe had both decided, practically, that they would solve problems as they came rather than borrowing anxiety from the future. Pruitt's conviction held through an appeal in late 1884. His lawyers tried twice to find grounds for reversal and found none. The case had been too carefully built. Monroe had made sure of that. In the spring of 1885, the Delgado family came to a dinner at Rose and Monroe's house that had somehow expanded to include 14 people, including Samuel Greer and his wife, Elena Vasquez, Luis Mendoza, Patricia Flores, and 3 other families from the community. James was almost a year old and was passed around the table like a small dignitary receiving his public. Monroe made coffee and talked ranching with Carlos Delgado's eldest son Roberto, who was now 16 and full of plans. Rose sat next to Elena Delgado and heard about the second planting season on restored land, the particular joy of harvesting what you grew on ground that belonged to you. She looked across the table at Monroe, who was listening to Roberto with genuine attention and asking questions that showed he had retained the details of previous conversations, which was one of the many things she loved about him. He caught her eye, and a small something moved in his expression, a warmth so specific to her that it felt like a private language. She thought about that first conversation in the jail. The desk between them and the afternoon light and Monroe saying, with no hesitation, "I need a newspaper." She thought about her father and his press and his belief that the truth in print was worth any cost. She had inherited that belief and lost it and rebuilt it here, in this small town that she had never intended to stay in this life she had not known she was going to find. She was 29 years old and her name was Rose Harper Bishop, and she had a son and a newspaper and a husband who was the most honest person she had ever known, and a town that was, imperfectly and incrementally, and with the ordinary complicated difficulty of real community, becoming the place it had the capacity to be. She was not done. There was more work and more stories and more editions of the Courier and more cases on Monroe's desk and more seasons to get through and more ways in which Caldwell Creek would test both of them. She knew that. She was not naive about the nature of towns or of systems or of people. She had 4 years of hard road before Caldwell Creek, and she carried that knowledge. But she also carried this: the creek in winter, clear and cold, the cottonwoods bare and beautiful. Monroe's handshake in the orange light of an autumn evening, a community meeting where 112 people discovered they had words. The sound of a printing press in a converted dry goods store, rhythmic and purposeful and deeply alive. And later that year, in the early months of 1886, when Rose discovered she was expecting again, she told Monroe by placing his hand on her middle without saying anything, and he looked at her hand and then at her face and he said, "Hello," as though greeting someone who had not yet arrived, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. Their daughter was born in September of 1886. They named her Clara Jane, for Rose's mother who had died when Rose was 7, and Clara was from the first moment a person of particular determination, who loudly communicated her preferences and was unimpressed by compromise. Monroe looked at her on the day of her birth and said, "She is going to be a good deal of work," in a tone of pure appreciation. By the time Clara was walking and James was running, and the Bishop household had the particular productive chaos of a home with small children and 2 working parents, Caldwell Creek had become something that Rose covered not just as a journalist, but as a resident who understood it from the inside. She wrote about its politics and its disputes, and its achievements and its occasional failures, and she wrote about all of it with the clear-eyed love that comes from having chosen a place, rather than simply been born into it. Monroe served as sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 11 years, until 1893, when the nature of the territorial system changed, and he transitioned to a position with the newly reorganized State Ranger Service, which kept him in Caldwell Creek with occasional travel. The work continued to be what it had always been: the navigation between what the law said and what justice required, conducted with patience and precision, and the stubbornness that Rose had listed among his acknowledged flaws, and that she had long since recognized, was more accurately described as integrity under pressure. The Courier published continuously, growing into a twice-weekly paper by 1888 and eventually expanding to a full daily by the mid-90s, when the town had grown enough to support it. William Cross became the managing editor in 1890, freeing Rose to do the writing and reporting she loved best while he managed the day-to-day production. They were a good team, and the paper they built together was one that her father would have recognized immediately as honest and would have been proud of. The Delgado family's land, fully restored, passed to Roberto's family when his parents were old. The Martinez family rebuilt and then some. Patricia Flores served as county commissioner for 8 years and was succeeded by a man she had mentored. Elena Vasquez's boarding house became the foundation of what eventually became the town's first small hotel. Samuel Greer's blacksmith shop expanded to serve the increased traffic of a growing town. Wade Prout died in Huntsville Prison in 1891, 8 years into his 12-year sentence, of an illness that the prison physician documented as pneumonia. Rose wrote a brief factual notice for the paper, which was all the space the truth required. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in March of 1893, Monroe and Rose walked along the creek in the early spring, the same walk they had done every Sunday morning since that first one, when the water was high and the cottonwoods were beginning to leaf. James, who was 9, had been left with Elena Vasquez. Clara, who was 6 and a force of nature, had been left also with Elena Vasquez, which was a greater act of trust. They walked without talking for a while, in the way of people who have learned that silence between them is not a problem to be solved, but a comfort to be inhabited. At the place where the cottonwoods grew thickest, Monroe stopped and turned toward her, and Rose saw in his face all of the years they had been in together, the hard ones and the good ones and the ones that were both at once, and underneath all of it the same thing she had first seen in the jail on the second day, the quality of a man who paid attention and meant what he said and chose his commitments deliberately. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. Are you sorry, he said, for the broken wheel and the small town and all of it? She looked at him in the spring evening light, this man she had not known she was looking for, and had found by accident in a town she had never meant to stay in. She thought of all the things that could have gone differently, the wheel that could have cracked closer to a larger town, the wagon that could have passed Caldwell Creek at a different time, the jail where she might not have gone, The case Monroe was building that might have moved differently if she had not arrived and provided the mechanism it needed. She thought about her father and about truth and about what it cost and what it was worth. "No," she said. "Not for a single day of it." Monroe put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and the creek ran clear and cold beside them, and the cottonwoods were leafing in the warm March air, and somewhere back in town, a small boy and a small girl were demanding something of the very capable Elena Vasquez, and the Caldwell Creek Courier was going to press tomorrow morning with a story about the county commission, and a letter to the editor about the school expansion proposal, and a notice about the spring planting cooperative and all the ordinary, vital, good enough to print news of a town that was alive and becoming more itself all the time. Rose Harper Bishop had promised herself no more small towns. She had made that promise in Kansas dust with ash still in her lungs and her trust in ruins and the certainty that caring was a trap she could not afford. She had been wrong, not about the cost of it. The cost was real and she had paid it and would pay it again. She had been wrong about whether it was worth the paying. It was. It was worth every last mile of it. Every broken wheel and difficult morning and page of evidence and quiet evening and shared plate and sleeping child and long walk beside a cold, clear creek. Every single mile had led here, and here was exactly right. She held on to Monroe Bishop under the cottonwood trees and felt his arms solid and sure around her, and she breathed the spring air of a place she belonged to and that belonged to her, and Rose Harper was home.